Well, thank you everybody for being here. It's nice to see everybody come for a Hohokam talk here in northern Arizona. What I've come to talk about today, I wanted to talk about some research I've been involved in for, it's probably been 15, 20 years. This has been something I've been interested in. Sort of kicked off from some of the early times around here when Dave was doing his work on ballcourts and got quite interested in things like site structure and basically how Hohokam society was put together. When I first started working in Hohokam archaeology, as you've seen discussed already in some of the reviews of the history of archaeology here, the Hohokam chronology went through quite a few gyrations, and there was a lot of controversy in particular back in the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. And it was causing a lot of problem for those of us who wanted to put the fine details on things as to how things worked in Hohokam society. Dave Wilcox spoke about courtyard groups and trying to get at that fine a level when you excavate a site. You need a pretty good chronology to be able to really put it together. And so one of the things I started with was trying to set up the ceramic sequence at a finer level than what Howery had done. Howery put together the basis for that with Hohokam buffware. I started in the Tucson Basin, that's where I live, and started doing archaeological work. So I started with Tucson Basin red on browns and worked to refine the ceramic chronology in Tucson. And then a little bit later, I had the opportunity with the work at the GRU site, worked with Dave Abbott, and worked at sequencing the buffware as well. And as a result of those studies, we were able to make a much finer ceramic chronology. And one of the things that allowed was the ability to look at how fast things happened. And Howery, because he had such long periods and phases, an individual phase was typically 150 to 200 years, it's hard to look at change in a culture at that level. And in fact, he viewed change in Hohokam as being something that was very gradual. He did not talk about any sudden changes, at least at later in his career when he was doing Hohokam work. And what happened when we started looking with a finer chronology is we started to see that there were periods where change was much more rapid. And the most dramatic of those points in time, at least from my standpoint, was that at AD 800. Now, it wasn't entirely new to say that there was something that happened in the colonial period. You've heard mention of people talking about migrants coming in from Mexico, that sort of thing. But the time it happened, how fast it happened, we didn't really think anymore that there were migrants coming in from Mexico on a large scale. That hadn't really been put together. And what I found when I started looking closely at it was that there was an awful lot happening in a very short period of time, and I became very interested in that. Some of the things that we most commonly think of as equaling Hohokam started at that time or thereabouts. Things like the ballcourts, there were a whole set of new funerary practices. Some of the ritual artifacts, they're called censers and palettes. The censers aren't really censers and the palettes aren't really palettes, but that's another story. They're still ritual items. Figurine tableaus, by that I mean you find in some cremations that show up in the colonial period whole sets of figurines, sometimes dozens of them broken up, and when they get reconstructed, there's everything from things that look like houses down to little pillow-shaped things and all sorts of things. Those show up then. There's quite a few caches of burned and broken items that show up both within cemeteries and sometimes outside of cemeteries. Perhaps really importantly, there's a new iconography that shows up at this time. It's what I call Style 2, and I'll show you what I mean by that. Capped mounds first show up. Now, we've heard about platform mounds today. We didn't talk really about the capped mounds. Howery talks about capped mounds dating to the Snaketown phase. I believe he was wrong on that. We've done some more work now with the ceramic data, and there were some things that I think were misinterpreted on that. I think they actually date to the middle of the colonial period. It's also when West Mexican mosaic mirrors or plaques first show up. They go on through the sequence for a while. And there's other things I'm not talking about right now. There's been a number of explanations about what happened then, most of them centered around religion or cult. And some of the folks in this room have talked about that. Two of the Daves here have talked about that. There's the Rainbow Way cult that Dave Doyle's spoken about. Dave Wilcox wrote a nice article on religion, actually several of them. I've got an article about this from back in the mid-90s. Stephanie Whittlesey, following Dave Doyle's work, put out the name Desert Regional Cult following. None of these explanations have been real satisfying to me, including my own from back in the 90s, because we didn't really try and develop it and follow through what the implications were. And I just wasn't satisfied, so I wanted to look at it a little bit more in depth. And this is the basic premise of what I'm putting out today, and several articles that are hopefully going to come out. For one, you have to have a reason why something drastic happens in a culture. And I think there's some pretty good evidence now that there's a variety of environmental and social stresses that happen in the 700s, particularly the mid and late 700s. And I believe that the best explanation is that there's an internal revitalization movement that occurred among the Hohokam, and that it resulted in the formation of one or more sodalities that were designed to tie the communities together. And I'm putting out two new names out there. I probably should be chastised for that, but I'm doing it anyway. I call it the Hohokam Revitalization Movement, and I call the Sodality or Sodalities sort of after, there's a whole range of things like this elsewhere in the country that are called medicine societies. And I think it's akin to those. And I call it the Ballcourts Society. There are problems with the abbreviations for these, though. I'll say that. These are the two papers that are hopefully coming out soon. And I want to acknowledge Mike Lindemann here, who worked a lot with me on these things. Now, new religious movements or cults, of which revitalization movements are one type, most of them are considered oppositional or external to the existing ritual power structure. And you can probably think of dozens of examples in modern times of this sort of thing. They're not sanctioned by, say, in recent times by the existing churches. You can point your finger at any number of things that have been called cults in the last 20 or 30 years. That's usually what we think of, but they don't have to be that way. And one thing that's very important to think about with Hohokam, and this is I think it needs to be seriously considered, is even with the newer population figures, the scale of Hohokam society at that time, at the late 700s, was probably not sufficient to have fostered the development of oppositional movements. You don't get pluralism in really small, well, I shouldn't say really small, but small-scale societies. It implies that new religious movements that would occur in the Hohokam would have been internal, that they were sanctioned by the existing ritual power structure, or it had to replace the power structure entirely. There are multiple reasons why cults develop. And I should say up front that the term cult is not used a lot in cultural anthropological work now because it gets, just in popular communication, it has negative connotations. That's not the intent here, nor is it the intent in anthropological work usually. Well, I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't be too broad on that. But I use the term cult in a non-judgmental sense here, put it that way. Nowadays, it so often gets associated with the thing that took somebody's daughter away and brainwashed her. That's not what we're talking about. Most researchers attribute the development of a new religious movement to a combination of a charismatic leadership and some sort of stress on society. It can be social stress, it can be economic, there's a variety of reasons. It doesn't just happen. There has to be a reason. Cults don't necessarily transform a culture entirely, but revitalization cults typically transform at least aspects of material culture, and I'm talking in terms of interests of an archaeologist here. They have an impact on the things that archaeologists would look at that would have to do with identity, because they're changing. It's revitalization. And it's not always going back. The term revitalization, there's some aspect of that term that could be conceived as meaning we want to just go back to the old ways. It's not, cultures don't ever go back to the old ways. It's always something new, but it may get talked about that way at the time. There's a lot of innovation that happens, a lot of creativity. There was a great article about Pueblo Revolt that came out a few years ago about this. Motivations for change here for Hohokam: environmental disaster, dramatic and potently timed astronomical events. Something that's important for the Hohokam is land tenure. Agricultural societies, land tenure is very important. There's only so many places you can put canals and there's only so much water. Circumscribed zones of habitation and agricultural development. Well, the Hohokam population centers are very much circumscribed. You can only expand so much. If there's growing population levels, these are all prime movers that archaeologists and anthropologists have talked about a lot. It's just whether a case can be made that they occurred at a key point in time. And the last one that I put there, shifting roles for ritual practitioners and those with ritual power, and that comes out of a number of studies that have been done about what went on immediately prior to this time. I don't have time to talk about that right now, but there's good evidence that there were changes, significant changes going on in ritual power. Who was in control and how was power distributed, that sort of thing. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this because there's a lot of detail you could, but one of the key points of data is the wonderful streamflow reconstruction that Don Graybill and others have put together for the Salt and Gila River. What it is they've, using tree ring data, they've been able to create a record of what stream flow is. There's a correlation between tree rings and stream flow of these rivers. So they're looking at the trees that are at the headwaters of the rivers, and they're able to interpret. They look at the historic period, they figure out what that correlation is, and then extend it back in time. And what can be said about this is that there's a strong correlation between years of high flow rates with the occurrence but not the magnitude of the flood events. So don't let somebody tell you that because there was a high record for a particular year, that doesn't mean there was a big flood that year. What it means is there was a lot of water the whole year. Because of course the trees are measuring, and a tree ring is measuring a year. So we can't say necessarily an individual flood, although it's probably a safe bet if you're at an off-the-charts year that there probably were floods. That's probably safe to say. There are differences between the Gila and Salt, and that's already been mentioned. today too. And, the Gila has a lot less water than the salt does, and it's less dependable. And that's really important because if you have a risk of running dry, then you have to have cooperation between different canals, people running different canal systems. And I believe that the most clear-cut data right now for using this is to look at the droughts, and in particular droughts followed by massive amounts of annual stream flow. Those are the times that would have been really stressful. And I'm not going to read through all this or anything, but what I want to get across is that the period from 728 to 804 was really nasty for the Hohokam, both in terms of massive annual flow and drought, serious drought. And this is the point in time when canal systems had been developed in the Salt River Valley and Gila River Valley, and populations had been developing up to this point. And this, I think, is one of the key indicators that there had to have been stress on the system at that time. Bruce Massey did some work looking at astronomical events to see whether there was anything that matched up with things going on for Hohokam. I think it's really interesting that two of the really high annual flow rate years, including the 749 event, which was just it was 8 times the standard deviation of the norm. They were preceded by total solar eclipses. That center gray area is the core area of the Phoenix Basin, and it goes all the way down to Tucson. So whether that had an impact or not, I don't know, but it's just interesting that it does correlate then. Here we know that there was a whole set of things that changed very rapidly in the culture. We know that there were stresses that were going on. I started looking at what data I could to see whether there's other things that give us clues about this. And of course, Hohokam buffware is a logical thing to take a look at because it's almost what defines the limits of what we call Hohokam. And that in itself is an important feature. Why does that particular type of pottery, what I call Middle Gila buffware or Hohokam buffware, which is coming out of a relatively small area, there may be 2 or 3 production areas, but they're all in a fairly small place there in the Gila River Valley or nearby. Why does that pottery have such a huge distribution, and not just a large distribution, but why is it commonplace over such a large area? Because there's other pottery types that do spread out over a big area, but they're at very low frequencies. We can dig a site in the northern Tucson Basin and find bucket loads of buffware. It's moving at a fairly large scale, as Dave spoke about for the Phoenix area, but I'm emphasizing the larger extent. So why is it special? And not only that, but it inspires a whole range of copies. And we know that it's the source of that because we've done studies that look at in the Tucson Basin that show that the designs that show up on the buffware are there before it starts showing up on the local brownwares in Tucson. There's a lag time. Not very long, it's pretty short. I can't say exactly because we don't have fine enough dating, but I'm guessing it's less than 20 or 25 years. But why does that happen? So it's adopted over a large area and it's copied over a large area. So the iconography is important. I mentioned the new iconography that comes in that I call Style 2. Prior to that time, you had a design style I call Style 1 innovatively. I didn't come up with more creative names there. But these are broad, I'm talking in a very broad sense. But Style 1 is a design that goes way back. It's present on artifacts back 4,000, 8,000 BC. And probably right from the beginning of people coming over here. And there's aspects of it that are worldwide even, because some of it's probably coming out of how we're hardwired in our brain. Style 2 shows up relatively suddenly. There's precursors to it that start showing up in the 700s, but it only becomes full-blown until right at about 800. And there are later changes and so on, but that's the point we're worried about. So this is a big change where you start seeing all these life forms and dynamic designs, real burst of creativity at that point. What I want to most get across from the buffware is that its distribution is special. The iconography that shows up is special. And it is that way because I think it's part and parcel of the identity of this new movement that happens. It's developed, it's part of that creativity that comes in a revitalization movement. It represents that. And you get the movement at the start, but then a revitalization movement is just that. It's something that happens relatively quickly. And then it depends after that what happens. Does it turn into a full-blown cultural ideology of some sort? Whatever. I'm suggesting that there are sodalities that develop, and I think that's the case because of the irrigation system. I think there was a need to tie things together. There needed to be cooperation. At some point on the Gila River, there would have been a critical point that said, we got to do something because, we're either going to fight about it or we're going to work it out because the water's running out. And I believe this was that point. And the revitalization movement kicked it off. That's how I view it. And I call the Sodalities the Ballcourt Society for obvious reason. The ballcourts show up at this time. You can see the blue dots. Those are the ballcourts that are most likely earlier ones, the ones that showed up in the late 800s, 900s. And the big thing to carry away from that is that right from the beginning, they're widespread. They go across the full range of Hohokam, those early courts, all the way from the furthest west coast court at Rock Ballcourt, all the way over to the one at Curtis, Buena Vista. And size-wise, if the large courts are just early, which I think they are, even the court down in Sonora fits that. So right from the beginning, there was the same sort of idea of what needed to be done. It went all over very quickly. I don't think they played the game like that, though. The only reason I put this in, because I know it's horribly confusing the way it's done, is to say that this movement is influenced by Mesoamerica. I think all Hohokam archaeologists agree that the development of the Hohokam relates to Mesoamerica. And the actual structure of the site is part of that. Right from the beginning, Dave Wilcox has been making that point, and I agree completely with him. And that has to do with plaza-centered villages, and you can call these cap mounds. They're not that much different from a little pyramid. I mean, it's something that you can go on top of and do ceremonies and talk to the village about, that sort of thing. When I was looking at trying to explain how this, one of the key things on this is, how does it spread so fast? Why does everybody adopt it? Why does somebody over in the Safford Valley and somebody out at Gila Bend get on board with this? Well, what are the processes? Everybody has to be connected somehow. And this is just sort of a list of the different ways that people are connected. And I think in various levels, all of these things are probably involved. The revitalization movement, I don't want to just read this, you can read, but the way I look at the revitalization movement as it applied to Hohokam is it's a transformation of ritual power. It's a transformation in how the ritual leaders of this society decided to do things, and they had to do something. If there was a major social and social economic stress, they have to do something. I mean, historically, religious leaders were killed when things didn't work out so well. There's a very strong, well, political leaders nowadays, we're certainly seeing that. You have to do something if there's a major stress on society. And I think they probably made the right choice for this and changed. And that change involved cooperation. It involved setting up a solution that tied populations together in what I believe was a secret society. And that's the Ballcourt Society. And I already mentioned this, so I'm going to skip. What's the symbolism involved? Well, there's a lot we probably can't see or wouldn't know how to interpret right now, but there's some things that I think are clear, and I'm not the first to suggest these things. Shiny things are certainly a part of this. The Hohokam made abundant use of shiny objects, and it's pretty obvious why. It's water symbolism. Water is shiny, and water was very, very important to the Hohokam. And Gila Butte is certainly a part of that. Gila Butte is the source of a lot of the schist that was used for buffware pottery, and for some of the plainware that Dave talked about that was going up into the Salt River Valley, but it's a key part of the buffware. And it also is used in the Tucson Basin. The villages that were producing decorated pottery were on a side of the basin that didn't have sand that had schist in it, so they imported it from the other side of the basin during the time period when ballcourts were in use. Shiny things were important. According to Bruce Massey, there's an association of the Snaketown Plaza to the winter solstice, how it lines up over Gila Butte. There's the orientation of the houses at Snaketown with the ball court. That's not present, insofar as I know, and I don't know whether there's any recent projects that have had the opportunity to look at this, whether it's unique or not. Some aspects of the Style II iconography, I think, are related to the cosmology and symbolism of the Ballcourt Society, and in particular, sheep, rattlesnakes, toads, and birds, and several key scenes. I think this bird attacking snake theme on Hohokam, it also shows up, that's a membrace pot, but it's primarily Hohokam. I can guess at the symbolism, but of course, I don't know the actual meaning of this, but birds are commonly, certainly associated with the world above. Snakes are commonly associated with the underworld. But there's all sorts of other symbolism that you can throw into that, and I'll let you think about that. I would be just guessing. But it shows up on pallets, on shell bracelets. It's not on sensors, but the snake-eating toad theme is on sensors. And it shows up only on sensors and very rarely on shell bracelets. It does not show up on pottery, or in pottery decoration. And toads are generally associated in the desert with rain, water, and potentially the underworld too, because they disappear for part of the year. But I think the water association is probably the most important for Hohokam. And it's interesting that snakes, and it's always, when you can tell, it's always rattlesnakes, are very important for Hohokam. I believe the crosshatch theme that you see on snakes in this depiction, you see that on pallets just by itself. I think it symbolizes the snake and whatever the snake symbolizes to Hohokam. And I think that's part of this iconography that is related to the Ballcourt Society. And that's where I will stop.